Abru News special interview with Dr. Justin McCarthy continues with more details on the historical prejudices against the Turkish people. Dr. McCarthy said that Turkish people have long been very quiet about the spreading allegations about Armenian genocide, starting with the early days of the new Turkish Republic.
Three reasons I believe that genocide is so popularly believed. One of them is that the Turkish government for many years would not discuss this issue, would not consider it. Part of the problem, this was a very good thing, but part of the problem was that it meant that no one would talk about what happened. No one was allowed really in Turkey to talk about what the Armenians had done to the Turks, what the Greeks had done. But in America, in Armenia, in France, in England, everybody said the Turks are guilty. Turks said nothing, absolutely quiet. It was only in the 1980s, really, it was only very late that Turkey started to talk about this at all. So the first reason is that the Turks didn't defend themselves. The second reason is obviously politics. In France, there are hundreds of thousands of Armenians. They vote. They make campaign contributions. They're rich people with businesses. It's the same thing in California. You have a lot of Armenian political power, and they use it for this purpose. The third reason is prejudice. Turks were considered by Americans, by Europeans, to be the leaders of the Muslims. They were considered to be dangerous opponents of Christianity. And these prejudices lasted for a long time. Most of the people now don't think that way anymore. They don't think about religion in that way, but the prejudices have continued. They've lived on in people's minds. So when people think about Turks, they think, oh, well, they must be guilty. They must be bad. And unfortunately, the opposition to this is very difficult. It's going to take many generations for Turks to make people all over the world realize that they're just regular human beings like everyone else, some good, some bad. But unfortunately, prejudice is very strong and very much alive still.
Historical evidences reveal mutual losses, but Dr. McCarthy indicates that Armenians simply ignore the deaths on the Turkish side.
Armenians started using the word very late, but they always, right from the first, they claimed that they called them massacres or they called them something else. The really important point about their side is that they don't consider that any Muslims died. They don't consider the other side. And it's true, there were massacres of Armenians in World War I. There were also massacres of Muslims. In fact, many more Muslims died in massacres than Armenians. But it wasn't until after World War II that they really started to push this really strongly in that way. But Americans, at least, and Europeans have always believed that the Turks were guilty. And the Armenians always said that the Turks had done this. They just didn't use the word, really. The word genocide was actually coined to describe what happened to the Armenians, first of all. Raphael Lemkin, who was the man who invented the word, used the Armenians as his example. He didn't know anything about the history, but he decided to use the word. And you find this a lot. You find that the people in parliaments, that historians who don't know the area, that people who write textbooks, that all these people, priests, ministers, rabbis, people that give lectures on this have never studied the history. They just know it's true. And that's an example of what prejudice is like. If you say to people, did the Turks kill the Armenians? They say, of course the Turks did. And you say, how do you know? And they say, well, I just know. I was in France, not France, I'm sorry. Again, I was in Belgium at the European Parliament giving a talk. And there was a gentleman who listened to the talk, and he just told me I was evil, that I was a bad man, that I was doing terrible things. And I said, why do you say that? He said, I just know you're like that. I said, have you ever read one of my books? He said, no, I've never read anything you've written, but I know what kind of man you are. This is prejudice. You've got to study the material before you talk, and unfortunately the prejudice is very strong.
We also asked Dr. McCarthy about the false evidences and the forged documents presented by the Armenian side to prove that the relocation of the Armenian population was a genocide.
They wanted to make the best case they possibly could. In other words, they wanted to prove their point as best as they possibly could. They wanted to say that the Ottoman government said, kill all the Armenians. But the Ottoman government didn't do that. So what could they do? They had to invent it. They had to make up the forms. They had to get blank telegraph forms, signed Talat Pasha on the bottom. Yeah? They had to do this in order to prove the point. But in fact, of course, they haven't, because Turkish scholars have demonstrated that all of this was invented, that none of it was true. That this, you know, that the telegrams were not right. They've looked at the signatures, they've looked at the records, they've looked at everything that there is, and they found that these things simply are not the case. But why people make it up? People lie all the time for their nation. People lie all the time in order to have their side win. This happens constantly, not just in politics, it happens in regular life too. People even lie to their wives sometimes.
Tune into Ebru TV to learn more about the historical facts about the alleged Armenian genocide.